It is 11 a.m., so we are going to get going. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle. I am joined by my colleague, Tom, and we are here doing this coal mining legacy and property transactions presentation in collaboration with Conveyancing Data Services. So just a bit of housekeeping, as always, before we get going. We are all, of course, still either working in the office or working from home, so hopefully you can hear us clearly, but apologies for any background noise. We will be recording today's session, so you will have access to a recording after the webinar, and we'll also have a copy of the slides, so do reach out to us if you'd like a copy of either, and we can get those back to you. And as always, your feedback is really very much valued, so there'll be a quick feedback survey that will launch at the end of the webinar, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a few seconds to answer some questions for us regarding today's presentation. As I mentioned earlier, I'm joined by my colleague Tom, who is a mining consultant here at Groundsure, and he will be doing the first part of this presentation, and I will be taking over the latter half of it. So everybody can see, this is our agenda for today, and we'll be covering quite an extensive bit on coal and the methods of coal extraction, the history, et cetera, so it'd be a really, really interesting session for you. But to get us going, I just thought, let's set the scene. I'm sure some of you will have seen these images before, but it really is to just kind of, again, set the scene and the overall background. So to give you a bit of context. So this first image that you see shows various mining risks. So that gray splodge that you see in the middle of that map is the Cheshire Brine Compensation District. You can see it covers a pretty small area. This yellow area that has now come up on the screen shows the coal field. So we're looking at roughly about 11,000 square miles of coal area between England and Wales, and that's what we are going to be focusing on today. And then just as a final kind of show, that green, or the very large green area that has come up on the screen, is the non-coal area. So, when we talk about mining, we do like to talk about all the different types of mining, because they all come with different areas of risk and different types of risk and different applications of risk all across the country. But for today, we are going to be focusing on coal. So yeah, so that's basically where we're at. I'm going to hand over to Tom, and he is going to get us going. So bear with me while I hand over the control. You should be able to go, although I can't hear you.
I have control. Morning, everybody. Morning, everybody. Great to be able to talk to you this morning. I apologise firsthand if I'm sounding a little bit croaky. I lost my voice at the weekend. I've only just got it back, just in time for this morning's webinar. So good timing. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the coal mining risk and legacy in the UK, and I'll start off with a little bit about the coal reserves. So the UK has an identified hard coal resources of approximately 3.9 million tonnes. So these are 33 million tonnes of economically recoverable reserves. These are available in operational and permitted mines. And there's another estimated 344 million tonnes in mines in planning. So a lot of tonnage of ore is there, and these have been discovered through geological feasibility studies and seismic investigations, and from what we know from previous mining operations. So there are also around 1 billion tonnes of lignite resources, and this is mainly in the areas around Northern Ireland, although in these areas lignite is not actually mined. So lignite, often known as brown coal, is a sort of inferior low-grade coal, which isn't really useful for very much, certainly not burning in any sort of economical way, and as such isn't really deemed worthwhile extracting the amount of cost and operation that would go into extracting the coal. Trying to get any returns on it would be somewhat difficult. So our coal reserves lie in places which are pretty well known for their coal mining heritage. They're kind of like the main obvious places in the Midlands and southern Wales. We've got a little strip down in Devon and Bideford as well. So this is the area of Bideford Black or Biddy Black. So this is again a sort of poorer quality, sort of almost chalky, powdery sort of coal. That again is no real use for heating or smelting or using within in the steel process, but it was used a lot in cosmetics and pigments. So the Bideford Black coal seams were worked by a network of relatively shallow coal workings in and around the area of Bideford, and this coal is exported and then bought up by companies such as L'Oreal and other such cosmetic providers. To use in sort of black makeup and for other pigmenting uses. So Northern Scotland holds a large percentage of the coal reserves in the UK, as well as places in the northeast of the country, like Durham. I'm based down in Cornwall. If any of you have ever visited with a sort of mining sort of hat on, Giva Tin Mine, which is down in West Penwith. There's a little link between Giva and an old coal mine in Durham, which I will link back to later in the presentation, which is quite nice. And of course, you've got the areas, like I said, in the Midlands and southern Wales, where coal mining heritage is something that runs really, really deep within the communities. And for many, it was kind of the real lifeblood of that community and the existence of those people. And even today, even though those areas are not actively being mined, coal mining is still a really, really kind of appreciated and recognized sort of career, and these people are held in really, really high regard in these areas. It's looked at with quite a lot of pride, which I always find really interesting when you've got areas that have been scarred so hugely by industrialization that it's seen almost by locals as sort of really beautiful and prosperous. It's a nice thing to consider, I think. So methods of coal extraction. So there are multiple styles of coal mining. Many that were kind of nice, really early and primitive workings, going right up until modern open cast workings that are still operational today. We're going to cover a few of them, but not all. So to consider the risk posed by the legacy of coal, it's important for us to have a clear understanding as to the types of mining and the extraction methods that have been carried out. And these techniques available to the miners at any point in time will vary depending on regional geology and what technology and innovation was available at the time. So the methods available to those who mined primitive bell pit workings, really ancient workings, are going to be very different to how coal is extracted today, for example. And this will help provide the consultants and our assessors the key information on the likely configuration of the workings, including the kind of size, extent, and depth of these workings. And it's a first step in understanding sort of why, if any, sort of movement or subsidence may occur. It's important to first understand the style and age and extent of these workings. So bell pit mining is a nice early form of coal mining. You can see some in the center there. So I'll explain a little bit about this section. So the grey lines are, like the bands, are the coal deposits, the coal seams. You've got a fault going in the middle. You should be able to see my arrow there, and you can see how that fault has made the coal seams sort of jump and change course slightly. So bell pit mining, these bell pits are found in areas where the coal is nearer the surface. It kind of makes sense if you think about the fact that they are early styles of workings, and we haven't got at this stage we haven't got any way of pumping. So if they go below the water table, they've got no way of getting the water out. their understanding of their kind of geotechnical understanding in terms of making sure that everything is secure, and they're kind of trying to mitigate the amount of risk in terms of collapse and any mine gas entry and such just isn't there. These are really primitive. So excuse me. So they have to be in the order of around 50 meters deep. This is what we typically see through investigation. And these are restricted to the primitive techniques available to the miners in terms of controlling the stability of the feature and risk of inundation. So this involves sinking a narrow shaft to access the deposit before working the coal out by hand, leaving a sort of bell-shaped excavation beneath the surface, as you can see in the image there. The coal is then winched to the surface via a bucket, similar to that of a well. So it will either have a man-operated windlass at top, or sometimes a horse whim, so a series of pulleys and a rope with a horse going around in circles. The highly unstable workings. So as the pit became unstable, the miners would return to the surface, pop a few yards either side, and sink another shaft adjacent to the previous one, hope to come down on the coal seam again. Examples of this type of mining that can be found in Yorkshire, also in the Forest of Dean. And to be fair, most coal mining regions will have them. So you're looking for those areas where the coal crops out at surface. Those are where you're most likely to find these early primitive surface workings. They lie largely unrecorded as well, except on old paper geological mapping, which we have access to, and some aerial imagery and LiDAR. So LiDAR is a aerial digital survey. I've got an example of one later, which shows a sort of topographic map of the ground below. And in these instances, clusters of these shafts can kind of be identified. You'll see what I mean in a bit, but it almost looks a little bit like the surface of a golf ball. You can see the sort of pitting all on the ground there where these pits were. So open cast mining, sometimes referred to open pit or open cut mining, is when coal seams are found in commercially favourable quantities near the surface. Here, the removal of a thin layer of overburden exposes the economically viable coal without the need for tunnelling deep underground. So you can see they're often seen today as kind of huge surface excavations cut down into the ground via a series of benches. And examples of open cast mines still in operation can be found in South Wales and Tyne and Wear and Northumberland. So the open cast pits, are the only coal mining still operational today. There is obviously the project in Whitehaven, Cumbria, that is kind of being debated at the minute. And that would be underground again, so be underground under the sea, tunneling like it in the style that we'll cover in a second. But as for now, as it stands, open cast is the only one there in still operation. So longwall mining. So this will be the last one that we'll cover on this. It's a form of underground coal mining where a large wall of coal is mined in a single slice. So large rectangular blocks of coal are defined during the developmental stage of the mine, and they are extracted in a single continuous operation. And this type of mining became popular in the Industrial Revolution when there became a huge demand for coal and for steam-powered engines and the national industrialization and coking coal needed for steel production. There was such a demand in these industries that coal was needed, and this way was highly effective in terms of yield and extracting a high tonnage from your mine. So bell pit mining. So this is an example of what we spoke about earlier, the bell pits. You can see there sort of narrow shaft going down through some of the overlying geology into the black grey coal deposit at the bottom there, and a chap digging out by hand and it being hauled up back to surface there. And it's important to say that the mines that you kind of think of today, which are just absolutely huge by comparison, some of them are bigger than stretch beneath multiple towns. They're so big. and they're only really there due to the advances in technology and demand through industrialization. So these earlier workings do exist, and these sort of ones, and what you're seeing on the right hand side there is an extent of a bell pits as they are today. So they've been abandoned and they've kind of grassed over now. They've collapsed in a little bit, which is why you get this definitive sort of cone, which is what we'll see in a moment on the LiDAR as well. And these primitive workings are dating to the early 1300s, but they do present a very, very sort of modern risk. The interesting thing is when these were abandoned, they were either left completely, in which case, you know, over time they would just collapse in on themselves, or they would be backfilled with the spoil that's at surface. So you can see there the small spoil heaps at surface. Those would just be backfilled and chucked in. So that's just loose, unconsolidated matter, which again is no real securing. So they would chuck that down until it kind of, well, choked. And in terms of kind of shaft securing, what that's called is sollering. So they would chuck timbers, you know, the spoil at the top down the shaft until it kind of choked itself, and then they'd fill up from the choke, and this leaves a void within that securing. And also because it's quite unconsolidated, there's going to be voids within the fill as well. So this is a really nice example of some bell pits. Now, straight up, I have a confession, they are Ironstone bell pits. So they are used for mining iron, not coal, but the image and the point of it remains, of the risk remains the same. And this image is kind of really great for explaining this. So this is quite a rare case in terms of they're really very obvious. Certainly from up here, these are being left as an area of specific scientific interest. So these are investigated and kind of looked after now, and geologists come here to learn from them. And you can see that most of them are enclosed here within these sort of fields. There's a few rogue ones popping out over here, and you've got farmland and some farm buildings here right next to a big main road. And just to the east of this image is a new housing development, I believe, that's going up. And you've got these areas of woodland around here, and there are more of the similar workings within them, within those areas of woodland. So it's interesting that you can take the areas that are sort of more obvious, or there are records for, and then make you a little bit more cautious about things that you would look for in the local area. For example, if you were to see a small depression on some LiDAR imagery, and it was on its own in an area where there was no recorded mining, you may not be as suspicious as if you've just seen these ones on some aerial imagery and then see further depressions in the nearby woods. It would kind of pique your interest and your concern, and make you assess the local area in a somewhat different light. So if we overlay this now with some LiDAR imagery, so what the LiDAR does is there's a light aircraft which flies overhead and sends a sort of like a laser signal down to the ground, and then that bounces back, hits the aircraft again, and it measures the time it takes and the distance, and then that compared to other readings is able to put together this mapping. Now what's really interesting is you've got these ones over here and the ones that were shown. You can see the sort of mounds, which is great because, you know, if they're digging a shaft and they are producing the spoil on the waste from that shaft, they're not going to transport it any further than they have to, so they just chuck it at the top, at the aperture of the hole. What you can see though is little dimples within these, in some of them. So these are the actual shafts themselves, the actual holes which have over time collapsed. Similarly over here, you've got these sort of light mounds, which may be something to be concerned of. Aren't as definitive as these ones. Now, if you then combine that with other data that we have available to us from other sort of geological sources, mine plans, and OS, and this understanding of some of our complex suite of sources and materials that we have on hand here, We then see that there are a number, these mounds indeed are representing a shaft. You've got this other little rogue one down here, which had no sign of kind of being there from the LiDAR. And again, this one over here. So it shows us the importance of looking at multiple sources and not taking something specifically at face value. For us, it's always important to kind of back up our thoughts and our interpretations with multiple sources and multiple data sets. And by doing that, we're able to kind of get a better understanding of the ground. And you know, the end result is ultimately to be able to confidently kind of pass as many properties as possible. That's the best. That's the best scenario. Is this what people want? Is there to be a minimal risk? And to be able to do that, it's having the best understanding of the ground that you possibly can have, and meant to make sure that you are assessing and reporting on the true risk areas and how that may affect you know, your property or your property transaction, which I believe we're going to come to in a bit later. So recorded mine workings and mine entries. So there should be some terminology here that you may have come across before within a coal mining report. So in terms of mine entries. So first, with recorded workings, there are over 20,000 square kilometres of recorded coal workings. That's from the Coal Authority license data. This is the same. Now, I tried to convert this into something that people could perhaps visualize, and I'm not sure whether I have done so. So it's the same as 2 million rugby pitches. So 2 million, I know, harder to comprehend, but at least the size of the rugby pitch is something we can relate to. And the shallow workings, those are something that have been worked between surface and 30 meters depth, and there are 925 square kilometers of those. So it's important to say that where past underground mining has been identified and there are no further searches to be carried out, that it should be noted that in the event of coal mining settlement or subsidence occurring, then the property will benefit from the protection of the Coal Mining Subsidence Act of 1991. This was amended in 1994. Can also carry out a visual inspection of the property. This will be done by a suitably qualified and experienced person, and it may just add a bit of value in identifying any currently identifiable mining related sort of settlement or subsidence effects. So onto shafts and adits. So our 2 mine entries. The shafts are something that most people have kind of come across when it comes to mining. That's something that you've heard of. So shafts are a near vertical excavation onto a mineral deposit or an ore body. So once they're abandoned, they're usually backfilled with timbers, quarry, spoil, or organic material. The problem with this is that over time, organic material can decay. And as it decays, this leaves voids within the fill. So if you add these voids within the fill, along with what we mentioned earlier about solaring and there being kind of a choke within the shaft and therefore a void beneath that choke, and in the holes within the fill. And at the moment we're seeing with the kind of acceleration of climate change and what's going on at the minute is with sort of rising sea levels and with lots of heavier rainfall, we're seeing that this heavier rainfall can enter mine workings. And when you've got sort of unconsolidated matter of spoil, any added water can wash fill and wash fines within that fill, fine sediments out. And this can add to the amount of voids or the size of voids within this fill. And eventually these will sort of slowly migrate to surface, as if you imagine there's a hole within that layer of fill, and the bits above that are going to become unstable and collapse into that hole, into that void, and eventually that will just get repeated and repeated until eventually it comes up and potentially affects the surface. This is when we start to see, you know, things reported in the local media where there's like sort of a sagging in the tarmac at surface or something like that, or a small hole appears and actually after investigation it's much larger than initially seen at surface. So that's a few of the things that can kind of the issues with primitive securing of mine shafts. Obviously, by today's standards, there are a whole lot more understanding of securing and load bearing securing works that need to go into making sure a shaft is safe. So adits are a horizontal tunnel-like feature. So these can be used for haulage, ventilation, access, water removal if you're mining below the water table. So if they figured out pretty early on that if they were working below the water table, obviously there's that influx of water into the mine, and to pump it all the way up a shaft to surface, it would take up an awful lot of energy and power and therefore money. And so if the water table is 150 meters below surface, then why pump the water up that extra 150 meters, for argument's sake, when you can drive a near horizontal tunnel and you can just pump up to that, and that tunnel can sit at exactly 100, just above 150 meters, and then you pump up to that. You're not having to pump all the way up to surface, and then it will naturally drain away because it's above the water table. So often the adits have shafts along their route, especially near their portal or where they discharge. Now, if you imagine the sort of mucky mine water that is being tipped out of these adits, it's full of sediments and heavy metals and all sorts of horrible nasties. It will clog up eventually. So near the aperture, near the portal, the end of the adit, there tends to be a number of adit shafts which are quite shallow, which the miners can pop down and muck out that adit and dig all that sediment and sludge away and make sure it's clear and running. This sometimes means that the adit is then rerouted. So if it gets to a point where that sludge just, is continually happening, or sometimes they need to reroute it into a different water course, then the adit can be changed. And as such, those shafts are left and the adit is rerouted and more shafts sunk along its course. So this can lead to the sinking of numerous additional adit shafts, which is something we need to be aware of. So a little look into the East Midlands. So it's home to some really rich coal seams and also some really nice thick limestone deposits, which is something that isn't necessarily thought of straight away when they think of the East Midlands. So the majority of the mines you'll find around Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, and these really helped fuel the Industrial Revolution, as we spoke about earlier. And it wasn't actually that long ago. So 2015 is when Nottingham's final closure came, and it had been operating for over 90 years, which is pretty amazing. So the two shafts, main shafts that were working this mine were sunk in the 1920s, and these reached 690 meters deep. So an insane depth for a shaft there. And at its peak, it was raising 100,000 tons of coal a week. So if we do a little bit of maths to make the profits converted into modern money, we're looking at around approximately £50 million a year from Thoresby. And onto Whitwick in Leicestershire. So this one, the expansion is really interesting. So it was founded in 1824. The 1870s saw a bit of an expansion, which included 5 more shafts. If you're thinking the amount of machinery that was around at this time, whilst they still had it, was obviously very costly and wasn't as readily available to miners as it is, say, today. It certainly didn't have the autonomous electric mining vehicles that they have now, which means nobody needs to go underground. So lots of this was still done by manpower. So in 1946, this mine broke the national record for output. And in 82, a 12-man team tunneled 400 yards in a week. And this broke the European record for this. And it's a really great feat if you think about how hard they would have had to have worked to tunnel that amount of distance. So connections were made with Snibston nearby, and then Whitwick closes in 1986. Snibston carries on. Going back to some of the styles of workings that we were talking about earlier, the subsurface workings at Whitwick included the longwall method, which is what we spoke about later. And in the later years, in the 1900s, when it was owned by the National Coal Board, so prior to the Coal Authority becoming the Coal Authority, lots of mechanised loaders and cutters, you can see, replaced the use of kind of pick and shovel. And wooden props were superseded with kind of modern hydraulic supports, much to the dismay of the miners. I was speaking to a few miners from down here in South Crofty mine that used to work at South Crofty down near where I live. And they were saying that it's kind of common for miners all over the country really to have preferred having wooden props within their mines. So some of these props that I got the privilege of seeing were kind of, you know, small bits of wood. Others looked like they'd put an entire tree into this mine to support the workings. And they said that the preference for the wooden props was the fact that if there was added strain on it and they were going to collapse, the wood would creak and it would splinter, and you could see it and you could hear it and you had time to get out. Whereas modern, more kind of metal supports, they just couldn't take any of the load anymore and would buckle and would just go. So they had a bit more warning, they felt, with wooden props. So a lot of the miners that are still alive today, yeah, certainly have a preference to the old ways, I think. So companion minerals. Coal deposits famously form with other things. So they tend to go in bands of, you'll have a coal seam and then there might also be some fire clay there or some ironstone, and it's likely that these would have been worked out as well. So depending on where you are geographically, depends on the sort of things you'd expect to occur with that coal, just due to the geological composition and what was happening in the East Midlands millions and millions of years ago, whether there be a forest or a lake or a sea or whatever was going on there at the time to form these geological features. So you can see here, obviously, you've got coal there as well. Ironstone is commonly seen to appear kind of above or below coal deposits in its own sort of seam. Similarly with fire clay as well, you can expect to see that in the areas as well. It's interesting, it's not just that, but at surface as well. So not a companion mineral because it's not, you know, interbedded within coal seams, but you often see at surface maybe some brickworks or some brick and tile works where they're working sort of clays and shales or sands and gravels to try and for kind of brick production and local industry to try and, you know, build some tiles or some bricks to really help build all these buildings that were needed to house the industry during the Industrial Revolution. It was quite a fascinating time, I think. And so this goes to demonstrate a little bit about the Ironstone. So in Liverton mine, this is a part of what you're seeing is in North Yorkshire. So there are coal deposits worked in and around this area as well. But to give you an idea of the sort of plans that show these workings, what you're looking at, these blue blobs are, or look like blue blobs, highly calculated and accurate blue blobs, are areas where there are recorded mine workings. So for our consultants, they can, you know, these are all spatially referenced and they give information as to what plans are available. So if we overlay now, we're going to look at this blob here. We overlay the plan for Liverton. You start to imagine the sort of size of these workings now. A bit more with a section there showing us exactly what's kind of within the geological strata there, looking down the main downcast shaft for that mine. Interesting, if we just look on the left here, you see these two areas which say Goaf within them. So these are areas that I've just been entirely worked out, or the materials have just been extracted without leaving massive amount of sort of pillars of sports, the kind of earlier styles of just take everything. So interesting areas of risk there where there's not a great deal of thought in terms of stability. So what you're looking at here, these blue they look a bit like city streets. These are the tunnels that are working, leaving square pillars and supports within. You've got these orange ones, which are kind of adits and tunnels or drifts, depending on where you are regionally. An adit can sometimes get called a drift or a sow. And then you've got these shafts here, and also the mine buildings at surface, which are really quite interesting to see, and some surface features here. So what's important to recognise is that, and this is transferable, this is not just specifically to Ironstone, but as what happens a lot in coal as well, is that these pillars that were left into support, when the mine closed, they wanted to get as much, obviously, out as they possibly could to get as much, recuperate as much funding as possible. So they'd often go back and rob the pillars, so rip out as much of the pillaring as possible, leaving tiny, tiny pillars in which were not fit for any sort of structural support of the mine roof at all. So these plans would be submitted upon abandonment, but is it truly representative of actually what's under the ground and the state the mine is in? That's questionable, I think. Which leads us nicely onto historical mining records. So prior to the 19th century, coal mining remained largely unrecorded. In 1840, the first mining record office was established in London, and it wasn't until 1872 that the Coal Mines Regulation Act came into action. And this made it a legal requirement to deposit an abandonment plan within 3 months of your date of closure. There was a requirement to produce a plan from 1850, but no requirement to formally deposit it anywhere. Which is fantastic, which is why every now and again you hear in the news about somebody finding a load of old plans in this shed or in a loft or at a yard sale or something, because they just turn up, because they were handed down, they were kept, some of them were burnt, got rid of, but so there must be loads out there that we don't know about yet, and that other kind of the governing bodies don't know about. And the key point to note here is that all that was required to show on these plans was the boundary of the mine workings up until the time of abandonment. There was no requirement for the orientation within the surface, to the surface, any depth or section information to be shown. So the sort of plan that we saw earlier was a lot later. And these abandonment plans were usually held to ensure the safety of the miners. They weren't obviously put together with a thought of how will this help the conveyancing process in a couple of 100 years. They were very much, now we know where these abandoned workings are, which may flood and may be unstable. When we're developing mines in the future, we don't want to end up tunneling into these abandoned workings, which sadly on several occasions has happened, and lots of miners have lost their lives due to tunneling into abandoned flooded workings. In around 1883, the Mining Record Office was transferred to the Home Office, no doubt, along with the collection of the plans. And in 1923 to 31, there were 2 mining accidents, following which there was a call for plans to be deposited, and it was widely responded to. And the significance of this is that now plans had to kind of fully identify underground workings in a way that was kind of legible and accurate, more so than it was before. In the late 30s, all the plans were transferred to Buxton from London, and after the war, after quite a lot of them had been damaged due to various war-related incidents, in 1950, coal plans were segregated from plans of other minerals and split into regional areas, allowing the plans to be more easily accessible. So this is why if you go to your regional local record office or archive, you can pick out plans that are relating to yours rather than having to travel all the way to Buxton to have a look at something. So the collection of coal plans, they were reunited in 1992 to what was then British Coal. They were at Burton-on-Trent at the time, and they were inherited by the Coal Authority on privatisation of the coal industry in 1994. And finally transferred to the Coal Authority's headquarters in Mansfield, where they remain today. The important reason why I've chosen to give you this somewhat potted history of the plans is that sometimes they were never produced, not deposited, lost in transit. That one's happened more times than I care to remember, when I've tried to get hold of a record office and they've said they've moved to a new premises, lost some things, but found other things that they had lost previously. So there you go. Sometimes they become unreadable, torn, written all over. I've seen T rings on them, and I've come across lots of them with blood stains on them. I'm not entirely sure what's happened there. But these tells us that the records that we consider are incomplete at best. The reasons why the plans were produced is not necessarily clear on the plans deposited. And for example, plans can show exaggerated reserves of coal drawn to raise interest and trying to raise share prices or to entice people to buy into the mine. The plans can show only a fraction of the mine's extent. They can mislead about the amount of people that were working in the mine in order to get out of paying certain taxes. And all this provides the reason that we should have an experienced and kind of competent assessors looking at the coal mining data and making sure that a proper coal mining assessment is undertaken. And it's a real integral part to the rationale of our CON29M and our coal mining assessments that we deliver today. So having now considered the where, the how, and the when coal mine was mined in the UK, we'll now look at how the mine searches themselves came about. So in 1947, the National Coal Board would respond to specific queries on a one-to-one basis. So no standardisation or real formalised responses were given. You could just phone up and say, I'm looking at buying this house in Birmingham, and they'd get back to you when they had a chance. From 1985, there was a computerized system put in place to help to respond to these queries in a bit of a more modern way. And this involved a team of archivists working tirelessly to collate all the coal mining data available for each property request. So similarly to how we used to do our original sort of tin mining searches back in the early 70s, where you'd get the request in from the solicitor on a letter, and you'd have to physically go through every paper version of map and plan that you had and fit them and try and make sure you got absolutely everything related to that property. And this was a task requiring a lot of manual intervention and time to assess the potential risk to a property. Moving on again, all the plans held by the Coal Authority, it's about 120,000 of them, had to be digitised and the data extracted from them. So this has been done, and it took a large number of mine surveyors to complete over a number of years, and this is what forms the Coal Authority digital mining data set, which was made available for industry professionals on a licensed basis. So this is the data that goes into our CON29M. And so this introduced a bit more choice and competition into the market, as well as providing an opening for innovative new products that are on offer today. So mining related subsidence. So the Groundsure CON29M provides information on any damage notice or subsidence claim for the property or within 50 metres of the property since 31st of October 1994. And this is shown in a table. It will give information on remedial obligation and any stop notices delaying the start of remedial works or repairs to the property. And where a record of a coal mining subsidence claim has been identified within the property boundary or immediately abutting the property, the details relating to the claim are included. And we recommend that the claims report is then obtained to help clarify any associated risk. Where subsidence has been identified within 50 metres of the property, whilst no further searches may be recommended or required, like we said before, it should be noted that if there is any settlement or subsidence affecting the property, that the property will benefit from the protection of the Coal Mining Subsidence Act of 91. This is something very different to every other type of mining and any other property that isn't on the coalfield anywhere in the UK, where the obligation falls to the homeowner. At least there is this protection put in place by the Coal Authority. So I've now guided you through approximately 360 million years of time where mining activity sped up in the last 200 years. We've considered the history of coal mining, the history of the plans, as well as where these workings lie. And we've heard how the types of mining reflects the depth and age of the workings, and therefore the risk posed to the property at the surface. And this is all the information that feeds into our CON29M. I'm going to pass you back to Danny, who's going to go through the products we've mentioned in a little bit more detail. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really interesting. So just really finishing up, it won't be very, very long, but really now I'm just going to quickly take you through, obviously, the report options depending on your requirement. And of course, today our focus is on coal, so we are going to talk about the CON29M, but really we've tried to give people the flexibility and various options depending on what your client is concerned about, i.e. some clients might be concerned about coal, some clients may not. It really just depends on what your client wants to know about. So quickly, the first report I'm going to talk about is our enhanced Vista. So this now comes with a full mining solution. I know we talked about coal today, but this particular report covers everything. So if you are trying to get all of your reports done in one, then this may be an option for you because it covers a full enviro, like you can see on the front cover. It does include a full CON29M, the Groundsure CON29M, which also includes the mine entry interpretive report as and when required as standard, in addition to also covering non-coal mining. So this could possibly be an option for your clients if they are in a known coal mining area, but they are also concerned about other types of minerals outside of coal, and this covers everything in one fell swoop. So if you get one of these, you won't have to purchase any other additional reports because it includes the Enviro, the CON29M, the Mine Entry Interpretive Report, a Cheshire Brine report if you happen to be in that area, as well as a full environmental report as well. So from a compliance perspective, based on what the conveyancing handbook recommends, this basically ticks all the boxes. You get everything in one report. Now, this is, I think, the only report actually that we have where it visits both our environmental consultancy as well as our mining team, because of course it has all of that information that needs to be assessed, but that covers you for everything as you require it. Should you not want an enviro included, we of course have the official CON29M, which is what you see on the screen as well. So this of course has been ratified by the Law Society. It follows all the standards. It uses the Coal Authority's data. It answers all 11 questions for residential and all 14 questions as set out by the Law Society's guidance. You also, as Tom mentioned earlier, it has the subsidence claims history up to 50 meters, so you don't have to get a buffer report, and includes the mine entry interpretive assessment as standard, even on mine entries outside of the prescribed 20-meter radius. So it does come with a few extra bits there, and it's, again, fully comprehensive and a fairly quick turnaround time as well. Now, I wanted to show you this because we do get a few questions regarding the zone of influence, which is the area of land that could be affected if subsidence of a mine entry occurs. So within the CON29M report, it's only basically, it is only a requirement to report on mine entries that fall within 20 meters of the site boundary, which is fair enough. However, as geologists and mining experts, we know that sites can be influenced by mine entries that are further away from the site than this. So as a result, our colleagues at Mining Searches UK have calculated the zone of influence for every mine entry that appears in the official CON29M and using the Coal Authority's data. We ensure that we map the zone of influence and let you know the risks, even when the mine entry is outside the prescribed 20 meters. But the zone of influence impacts the site. So we've given you various scenarios on the screen that are numbered. So the first on the top left is a mine entry within 20 meters, but the zone of influence doesn't encroach into the property boundary. So this is okay and no further action would need to be taken. The second instance, number 2, the mine entry is within 20 meters and the zone of influence encroaches into property boundary. This isn't ideal and further action may be needed in a scenario like this. In the third instance, number 3, mine entry, the mine entry is outside the 20 meters, but the zone of influence encroaches into the property boundary. Again, this isn't ideal and further action may be required in this type of instance. And fourth, this is the ideal situation, which is basically both the mine entry and the zone of influence both sit outside of the property and no further action will be taken. So we wouldn't display the zone of influence in this report in that instance, because that's what you want. And then lastly, the mine entry is within the property boundary, and as such, so is the zone of influence. And again, further action should be taken here. And it's really just to show you the extreme amount of work and care that goes into these types of calculations. Things like diameter, the diameter of the shaft, the diameter of the mine entry, the accuracy of the mine entry, the depth of the superficial deposits. All of those things are just a few of the points that they look at when they're actually trying to determine what the zone of influence is. So this is why it's really, as Tom said, it's really important that you get an expert to look at this stuff, because that's, you know, they are best qualified to be commenting on this type of information. And then the final report that I'm going to talk about is the GeoRisk. So this really, again, is another option for a client. So if you have a client that sits in a both coal and non-coal mining area and they want to cover both but don't want an environmental report, then you have something like a GeoRisk Plus, which includes a full CON29M as standard, plus a non-coal mining report. So again, it really, really depends on what your requirements are, what your client wants. We do have alerts for these. We do certainly from the Groundsure website recommend these reports based on the true risk found when you put the address of the property in. And again, from when it comes to guidance and next steps, from a coal mining perspective, it's pretty straightforward, because the coal authority have a duty and obligation to fix the issue if you do happen to be in an area that's being affected by coal mining. But if the property is found to be affected by anything outside of coal mining, as Tom mentioned earlier, you're pretty much on your own. So in those instances, if you do decide to get something like an Avista or a GeoRisk Plus, which includes the non-coal mining, we will always provide you and your clients with full guidance and next steps, depending on what kind of risk we find affecting the property. Tom, would you be able to provide some examples of, let's say, what advice we would give somebody if we found some type of non-coal mining risk on a property?
So, in terms of further action, there's kind of the main two that we would go with. Would be kind of a visual inspection by like a RIC surveyor, where they would look for visible signs of settlement or subsidence relating to mine, or sort of a site investigation, which would be physical intrusive works, whether that be trenching or drilling, like borehole drilling, to kind of identify the extent of the working. So where those two would come to place, the first one, a visual inspection. Let's say, for argument's sake, there was once a small gravel pit in the area of the property, which has since been backfilled. We know that through looking at historical survey and geological plans. So it's now been levelled off, but they have subsequently built upon it. There may be a case of that fill not being fully compacted, or there being movement within that fill, so, and therefore that could cause settlement. So it would be prudent then just to have a qualified surveyor to come have a look and just to see if there are any signs of that happening at the time. Obviously important to bear in mind that even that inspection at the time is giving you just an insight as to what has physically happened on the day he's seen it, and that 6 months, however long after, you never know, something can still happen. It's not guaranteed pass forever, but gives you an understanding of the property at the time. For the site investigation, there may be a mine shaft affecting the property relating to non-coal, so it could be say like a tin mine, and it could be a shaft within the property. It would be prudent then for us or for somebody to come in and do a physical investigation. In those sort of scenarios, it typically involves drilling a series of boreholes to fully identify the shaft, to find it first, and then to, because you are dealing with records which can be up to hundreds of years old. So locate the shaft, then find its full extent, and then it will be kind of excavated out, and an appropriate remedial scheme put in place to make sure that everything is a-okay, and the client can end up living happily in his or her house forevermore. Really, this is the end goal.
Okay, cool. No, thank you so much, Tom. But yeah, it just gives you, I hope this gives you an idea of kind of the amount of information, care, and assessment that our team provides when it comes to the coal, the coal and other non-coal mining risks. So it's really just as a reminder as well that should you get one of, if you these reports and you have any questions or concerns, we are more than happy to speak to yourself to guide you on next steps. But also, if you have a client or homeowner that is kind of freaking out, then they are also able to speak to our consultants, and we can basically handhold them should you need it. I just had a question come through. I will absolutely be sharing a webinar and all the slides for this as well, so not a problem at all. But thanks very much for attending this session. I hope you have all found it useful and interesting. And again, a big thanks to Tom for lending me his voice despite his illness. So really, really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your morning. And as always, there'll be a feedback survey popping up at the end of the session, and we'd love it if you could take a couple of seconds to provide us some feedback. So thanks very much and have a great rest of your day.